Hello and welcome to GamerCents. We're making sense of what to buy. Our first video is going to be a bit of a history lesson. In order to know what is and isn't worth your precious pennies, we need a baseline. A starting point, if you will, to judge the actual value of a pre-order or new DLC. The video game industry today is booming with AAA studios and indie developers constantly making headlines. Both good and bad press have kept creators and players alike on their toes. And what makes a video game successful is something that every company seeks to pin down in marketing and development. Men and women all over the world spend countless hours on marketing materials, promotions, commercials, social media, and other marketing productions to make sure their game is known about, not to mention millions of US dollars. But what happens when publishers begin to release games that are so bad, and in such great volume, that they nearly kill an industry, and everybody hears about it? This is the premise behind the North American video game crash of 1983. But were the usual culprits, Pac-Man and E.T. the Extraterrestrial, the only real main causes? When you take a look at the entire picture, it seems to be an inevitability. Between the sheer number of games and consoles being pumped into stores and onto shelves, consumers were simply trampled in the path of subpar games and home consoles. Few of which delivered on the promise of taking your favorite arcade games home in their full glory. However, it seems the focal point in modern history is on two games, two companies, and believe it or not, two programmers. Technology was reaching new heights. Computers were moving into people's homes. The world was changing. The very concept of having an arcade in your living room was reserved for the rich. Now it was available on your very own TV set. Things were great for companies like Atari and Coleco Industries. And though the numbers now show a looming period of disruption, everybody was celebrating the technological achievements. From the Atari 2600 to the Nintendo Family Computer, things looked good for home consoles. But soon came something that nobody had predicted. Some of the worst video games of all time. Today, Pac-Man is a household name, and one of the most recognizable video game characters of all time. But things could have gone quite differently. If the public wasn't so fixated on the fact that they could have it at home, numbers might have been even worse than they were. But as Atari already owned the rights to produce Namco's arcade games for their home consoles, Pac-Man seemed an easy profit and a surefire hit. To some degree, they were right. The job of porting Pac-Man came down to a man named Todd Fry. Fry would be paid 10 cents per cartridge in royalties. However, there was a catch. He only had 4 months to program the game, without any schematics from the arcade version. Atari was more concerned with releasing the game as soon as possible than producing a competent copy of the original. However, many of the issues were due to the hardware limitations of the Atari 2600. Once finished, Atari pumped out 12 million copies of the game, an incredible 2 million more than the Atari 2600 itself were out in the wild. And Todd Fry was paid $1.2 million for his work. People quickly realized this wasn't the same Pac-Man they knew and loved. The complex mazes were nowhere to be seen, and Ghost flickered, making it much less visually appealing. Colors were changed, and the small pellets were now small rectangles. The game was Pac-Man by name, and that seemed to be all. A whopping 5 million copies of Pac-Man went unsold. Things didn't look good. And yet, it was still the best-selling title for the Atari 2600 of all time. But of course, it's not the only culprit that modern history catches in its crosshairs. In the case of E.T. the Extraterrestrial on the Atari 2600, it was a matter of desperation in marketing that has led to their infamy in the part of the crash. It was a time where computers were scarce, and programmers even more of a rarity. This was only a decade after the invention of the backspace key, after all. Enter Stephen Ross, head of Warner Communications. Stephen told Atari CEO Ray Kassar that he wanted to push a blockbuster title on the Atari 2600, something as big as a Spielberg film. E.T. was, in their minds, the perfect candidate. So, knowing he had a deadline of only 6 months to work with, Ray Kassar hired a man named Howard Scott Warshaw to develop the game. Of course, this was only after the deal was struck between Warner Communications, director Steven Spielberg, and Universal Pictures. It has been reported that Warner Communications paid between 20 and 25 million US dollars for the licensing rights, a price considered outlandish at the time. In fact, only a few years after Atari's inception, the company was bought by Warner Communications in 1976 for between $28 and $32 million. Howard Warshaw, on the other hand, was reportedly paid 200,000 US dollars and sent to Hawaii on an all-expenses-paid vacation. With such a popular name behind their game, it was certain to be a success. However, upon seeing the game's design, Spielberg wasn't flattered, and made notion to change the game into more of a Pac-Man clone. The company was weary to do so, and Warshaw flat out refuted this idea. However, later stated it might not have been a bad idea, or at least, it might have flopped for different reasons. As a result, the game ended up with no real direction, a bizarrely simple art style, and nearly non-existent gameplay. It is often considered one of the worst games of all time. We think it's pretty clear as to why. So what else caused the crash? What can we learn from it? And how can we avoid a similar disaster in the future? When an industry reaches a point that consumers and companies alike no longer care about the products they are buying or the products they put out, everybody suffers. Atari lost $536 million in 1983, and the industry as a whole saw revenue drop from $3.2 billion annually in 1982 to $100 million in 1985. This was truly an economic disaster for an entire industry. It wouldn't be until 1988 that things looked promising for video games again, and even then, the damage had already been done. Today, anybody can make a video game and release it on various platforms. And an unfortunate trend may be starting to form. Consumers are every bit as responsible for buying quality products as producers are for developing them. And when we stop caring whether or not it was worth the money, we leave an opening for companies to take advantage of us. So before you buy that next early access title or new skin, ask yourself, does this make sense? If you liked this video, consider subscribing and sharing us with your friends. And of course, thanks for playing.